It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried only led into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected they would. But soon they came into a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor, and after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a little kind of upstairs hall and a door that led out onto a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old books, and bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle on the windsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it was very foolish to set oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her as to not bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel the woodwork against the tips of her fingers. But she could not feel it. "This must be a simply enormous wardrobe," thought Lucy, still going further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching underneath her feet. "I wonder is that more mothballs?" she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of the feeling of the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went a step or 2 further. Next moment she found what she was rubbing her face against and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it's just like the branches of trees!" exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later she found that she was standing in the middle of the wood at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the wardrobe open, for she knew it was a very silly thing to shut oneself in. It seemed to still be daylight there. "I can always get back if anything goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow, through the woods toward the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of the wood and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upwards he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first, because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella, so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange, pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. But with the parcels in the snow, it looked as if he had just been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Good gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. Is that my end?
Got about 10 seconds
Oh. That's all I really
So yeah.
Yeah.
And our next nerd fighter for her 5 minutes of fame, I guess.
I'm reading to you from A Separate Piece by John Knowles. "Swimming in pools is screwy anyway," he said, after a long, unusual silence as we walked toward the dormitory. "The only real swimming is in the ocean." Then, in the everyday mediocre tone he used when he was proposing something really outrageous, he added, "Let's go to the beach." The beach was hours away by bicycle, forbidden, completely out of all bounds. Going there risked expulsion, destroyed the studying I was going to do for an important test the next morning, blasted the reasonable amount of order I wanted to maintain in my life, and it also involved the kind of long, labored bicycle ride I hated. "All right," I said. We got our bikes and slipped away from Devon along a back road. Having invited me, Finney now felt he had to keep me entertained. He had long, wild stories about his childhood. As I pumped panting up steep hills, he glided alongside me, joking steadily. He analyzed my character, and he insisted on knowing what I disliked most about him. "You're too conventional," I said. He rode backward with no hands. He rode on his own handlebars. He jumped off and back on his moving bike as he had seen trick horseback riders do in the movies. He sang. Despite the steady musical undertone of his speaking voice, Finney couldn't carry a tune, and he couldn't remember the melody or the words to any song. But he loved listening to music, any music, and he liked to sing. We reached the beach in the late afternoon. The tide was high and the surf was heavy. I dived in and rode a couple of waves. The wave reached that stage of power in which you could feel the whole strength of the ocean around it. The second wave, as it tore toward the beach with me, spewed me a little ahead of it, encroaching rapidly. Suddenly it was immeasurably bigger than I was. It rushed me from the control of gravity and took control of me itself. The wave threw me down in a primitive plunge without a bottom. Then there was a bottom, grinding sand, and I skidded onto the shore. The wave hesitated, balanced there, and then hissed back toward the deep water, its tentacles not quite interested enough in me to drag me with it. I made my way up on the beach and lay down. Finney came, ceremoniously took my pulse, and then went back into the ocean. He stayed in an hour, breaking off every few minutes to come back to me and talk. The sand was so hot from the all-day sunshine that I had to brush the top layer away in order to lie down on it, and Finney's progress across the beach became a series of high, startled leaps. The ocean, throwing up foaming sun sprays across the nearby rocks, was winter cold. This kind of sunshine-lit ocean, with the accumulating roar of the surf and the salty, adventurous, flirting wind from the sea, always intoxicated Phineas. He was everywhere. He enjoyed himself hugely. He laughed out loud at passing seagulls, and he did everything he could think of for me. We had dinner at a hot dog stand, with our backs to the ocean, in its now cooler wind, our faces toward the heat of the cooking range. Then we walked on toward the center of the beach, where there was a subdued New England strip of honky-tonks. The boardwalk lights against the deepening blue sky made an ideal starry beauty, and the lights from the belt of honky-tonks and shooting galleries and beer gardens gleamed with a quiet purity in the clear twilight. Finney and I went along the boardwalk in our sneakers and white slacks, Finney in a light blue polo shirt, and I in a t-shirt. I noticed that people were looking fixedly at him, so I took a look myself to see why. His skin radiated a reddish copper glow of tan, his brown hair had been a little bleached by the sun, and I noticed that the tan made his eyes shine with the cool blue-green fire. "Everybody's staring at you," he said suddenly to me. "It's because of that movie star tan you picked up this afternoon. Showing off again." Enough broken rules were enough that night. Neither of us suggested going into any of the honky-tonks or beer gardens. We did have a glass of one beer each at a fairly respectable-looking bar, convincing, or seeming to convince the bartender that we were old enough by a show of forged draft cards. Then we found a good spot among some sand dunes at the lonely end of the beach, and there we settled down to sleep for the night. The last words of Finney's usual nighttime monologue were, "I hope you're having a pretty good time here. I know I kind of dragged you away at the point of a gun, but after all, you can't come to the shore with just anybody, and you can't come by yourself. And at this teenage period in life, the proper person is your best pal." He hesitated, and then added, "Which is what you are." And there was silence on his dune. It was a courageous thing to say. Exposing a sincere emotion nakedly like that at the Devon School was the next thing to suicide. I should have told him then that he was my best friend also, and rounded off what he had said. I started to. I nearly did. But something held me back. Perhaps I was stopped by that level of feeling, deeper than thought, which contains the truth.